James Whittaker walked into the Charlotte office that morning with his usual calm precision,
Oh,
while Daniel Cross carried the restless energy of a man who could never settle for second place. For months, their rivalry had burned quietly, feeding on ambition and suspicion, until the tension became too heavy for the walls around them to contain. No one expected the feud to end in violence, but before the day was over, 5 gunshots would echo through the glass tower and leave a city reeling in shock. Charlotte in the late summer carried with it a rhythm that felt almost mechanical. The sun reflected off towers of glass and steel, and the sound of traffic mixed with the footsteps of workers rushing toward office buildings that rose like monuments to ambition. Inside one of those towers, a financial firm ran with precise order, where deadlines were measured in minutes and success was often displayed in numbers on glowing screens. The work was demanding, but many saw the office as a path to stability, a place where effort might eventually bring reward. Yet beneath the surface of this polished environment, small cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that no one noticed until they grew wide enough to swallow lives. Among the desks and cubicles, 2 employees stood out. One had built a reputation for being meticulous, the kind of worker who never left loose ends and who treated every task as if the company's reputation depended on it. This person stayed late, often long after others had gone home, leaving the office bathed in the glow of a single desk lamp. Colleagues admired the dedication, even if they sometimes whispered that the perfectionism bordered on obsession. The other employee carried a different energy, one marked by restless ambition. Every success was a stepping stone, and every obstacle was an enemy to overcome. Where others saw teamwork, this person saw competition, and behind every smile there was calculation. The clash between discipline and ambition was not loud at first, but its presence lingered in the air. It's invisible yet undeniable. At first, their differences were subtle, barely noticed in the shuffle of daily work. But as projects came in and promotions were announced, their paths began to cross more often. And each encounter left behind tension that others could sense but could not explain. In meetings, one would present carefully prepared reports only, to have the other challenge them with aggressive questions. In the hallways, polite exchanges felt strained, carrying the weight of unspoken resentment. What should have been healthy competition slowly took on the shape of something more corrosive. And yet it was easy for co-workers to dismiss these interactions as simple workplace rivalry. Offices, after all, often housed personalities that clashed without consequence. Still, there were moments when the atmosphere seemed heavier. A misplaced document would spark suspicion. A project reassigned at the last moment would ignite frustration. These small incidents might have passed unnoticed in another setting, but here they became reminders of the growing fracture between the two. Each believed the other was undermining them, and each began to interpret mistakes as deliberate attacks. The office environment, meant to encourage cooperation, became a chessboard where every move was calculated and every gesture questioned. What made the situation more dangerous was how invisible it appeared to those on the outside. To managers, the rivalry looked like determination, 2 strong employees striving for excellence. To co-workers, the tension was something to be avoided, not confronted. People chose to keep their distance, unwilling to step into a conflict that did not directly involve them. In this way, silence became its own form of complicity, and the divide continued to deepen unnoticed. The city outside moved with its usual pace, unaware of the storm quietly gathering inside. Each morning, workers filled the building with their chatter, their coffee cups, their endless lists of tasks, while 2 individuals walked among them carrying grudges that grew heavier with each passing day. Neither could have known exactly where the path would lead, yet both seemed pulled toward it with a force that felt impossible to resist. Charlotte was a city of opportunity, but inside this particular office, opportunity had twisted into rivalry, and rivalry was beginning to harden into hatred. It was the kind of shift that no one recognized until it was too late, a subtle transformation of ordinary frustrations into something much darker. Something that would eventually break through the walls of glass and steel in a way no one could forget. The office carried on as if nothing was wrong, yet small signs of unease were beginning to slip through. The rivalry that once felt like quiet competition had started to cast shadows that were hard to ignore. Coworkers noticed the raised tones of arguments behind closed doors and the slamming of filing cabinets after long meetings. People exchanged uneasy glances when tensions flared, but most avoided getting involved, fearing that stepping between the two rivals would only make them the next target of frustration. The building still looked like a place of order and professionalism. From the outside, but inside, cracks were running deeper every week. Rumors began to spread across the office floor. Some whispered about harsh words exchanged late at night when most had already gone home. Others claimed to have seen threatening notes left on desks, though no one could confirm their source. What everyone agreed on was that the air felt charged, heavy with conflict that no one dared to speak about openly. The firm's managers dismissed these concerns, calling them overblown stories fueled by stress. They encouraged workers to focus on their tasks and reminded them that pressure was part of the job. Yet ignoring the growing hostility only allowed it to fester, giving space for suspicion and anger to flourish unchecked. The two rivals themselves were caught in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. Each believed the other was determined to sabotage them, and every small mistake was twisted into proof of betrayal. When a report went missing, one assumed it had been stolen. When a client complained about an error, the other became convinced that it was planted. Each event, no matter how minor, reinforced the idea that an enemy was lurking just across the aisle. It was no longer about promotions or recognition. It had become about survival, a personal battle where trust had been erased entirely. There, coworkers began to adjust their own behavior to the growing hostility. People avoided asking either rival for help, afraid of being dragged into the feud. Team projects became tense exercises where others tried to balance carefully between them, offering neutral words and forced smiles to keep peace for a few hours at a time. The office, once filled with casual conversations and laughter over coffee, breaks became quieter, a place where people measured their words and watched their steps. The walls themselves seemed to hold on to the tension, as if they were waiting for the breaking point. Outside the office, the bitterness followed them. Parking spaces became arguments, lunch breaks were spent in silence, and even social gatherings connected to work grew awkward. The feud had begun to leak into every part of their lives, turning ordinary routines into reminders of animosity. It no longer mattered who was right or wrong. What mattered was the constant feeling of being hunted, of needing to strike before being struck. The rivalry had crossed a line, shifting from professional disagreement to personal vendetta, one that demanded resolution. Those who sensed danger still hoped it would end quietly, perhaps with one rival leaving for another company or with management finally intervening, but that never happened. Instead, warnings were brushed aside. The workplace carried on with the same rhythm of deadlines and meetings, blind to the storm gathering in its own halls. The rivalry had transformed into something far more dangerous than anyone realized. A silent battle in which both sides felt cornered and desperate. The stage was set for something irreversible, but those who worked alongside them could only see fragments. Unable to piece together the whole picture, what no one knew was that the feud was approaching its peak. Resentment had hardened into resolve, and thoughts that once would have seemed unthinkable were now being quietly entertained. The pressure inside the building was no longer the pressure of finance and deadlines, it was the pressure of two lives, colliding in a way that could only end in disaster. The morning began like so many others, with sunlight bouncing off the polished glass of Charlotte's office towers and the usual stream of workers pouring into the building. No one sensed that anything was different. The lobby echoed with the sound of shoes on marble floors. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, and elevators carried people upward to another long day of meetings and reports. Yet within the ordinary routine, one individual arrived, carrying a weight no one else could see. Beneath the surface of business attire and polite greetings, there was a mind simmering with resentment, a heart pounding with unsteady resolve, and a secret hidden in a bag meant to hold papers and files. As the morning hours passed, the office filled with its familiar rhythm. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and voices rose and fell in conversations about numbers, clients, and deadlines. The soundscape was one of normality, but behind one desk, thoughts raced in sharp, chaotic patterns. Each glance at the rival across the aisle felt like a spark on dry ground. Each reminder of past slights like fuel added to an already growing fire. Months of tension, suspicion, and perceived betrayal had built into something heavy, something unbearable. For this person, there was no longer a question of if things would boil over. Only when, around mid-morning, the pressure reached its peak. A client call ended in frustration. A file went missing, and whispers in the hallway felt like conspiracies meant to mock and humiliate. The rival moved about the office, unaware of how each ordinary gesture fed the storm inside the other. The urge to act became impossible to resist. The bag was unzipped under the desk, hands trembling as they reached for the weapon hidden inside. The object felt cold and final, a tool that transformed anger into irreversible reality. The first shot rang out so suddenly that many thought at first it was a piece of machinery, backfiring or something heavy, crashing to the floor. But the sound was too sharp, too violent, and the scream that followed made the truth undeniable. Papers flew into the air as workers dropped to the ground, their instincts pulling them under desks and behind cubicle walls. Another shot cracked. Through the room, then another, until 5 blasts shattered the fragile order of the workplace. Each one echoed through the glass and steel tower, a sound that could never be taken back. Chaos consumed the office in seconds. Chairs toppled, computers crashed to the ground, and the once ordinary space became a scene of panic and terror. The rival who had been the focus of such consuming hatred fell in an instant, while others scrambled to safety, their faces pale with disbelief.
Ow.
Some froze, unable to move, while others sprinted toward exits, colliding with one another in the desperate need to escape. The sterile environment of reports and spreadsheets was transformed into a battlefield marked by blood and fear. Outside, pedestrians looked up at the sudden commotion. Some heard the muffled cracks and thought of construction work, while others caught sight of panicked faces pressing against windows far above. Within minutes, sirens pierced the air, racing through Charlotte's streets toward the tower that had just become the center of a nightmare. Police vehicles and ambulances converged at the base, their lights flashing against the mirrored windows that reflected the chaos within. Inside, the shooters stood frozen for a moment, staring at what had been done. The silence that followed the last shot felt heavier than the noise itself. Coworkers' cries echoed in the background. The ringing of phones continued without anyone to answer. And the realization of what had occurred began to sink in for everyone present. 5 shots had torn apart not only 2 lives bound by rivalry, but also an entire community of workers who would never again see their office as a place of safety. The day had started like any other, with coffee, deadlines, and routine. It ended with shattered glass, broken lives, and the haunting knowledge that an ordinary feud had spiraled into irreversible tragedy. The sound of sirens grew louder as emergency vehicles raced through the Charlotte streets, converging on the towering office building that had suddenly become a scene of horror. Red and blue lights reflected across the glass facade, while terrified employees poured out of side exits. Many of them trembling, some sobbing, their clothes marked by the chaos. They had just escaped. Police officers rushed inside with weapons drawn, moving quickly through stairwells and hallways that only an hour earlier had been filled with nothing more threatening than the smell of coffee and the low murmur of work conversations. Paramedics pushed stretchers through the crowd, guided by frantic shouts from those who had seen the worst of it firsthand. Inside, the once orderly workspace was unrecognizable. Desks were overturned, papers littered the floor, and computer screens glowed unattended in the chaos. The air was thick with the ringing silence that follows violence, broken only by the muffled cries of survivors still crouched behind furniture. Officers moved cautiously, unsure if the shooter might still be at large, calling out commands that echoed through the wide-open office. When they finally reached the heart of the floor, the grim reality was undeniable. The bodies of the fallen marked the end of the feud, the physical proof of a rivalry that had spun beyond control. The shooter stood nearby, disarmed at last, a shell of the person who had walked in earlier that morning with such grim determination. Detectives arrived within minutes, their sharp eyes scanning every corner. They listened to witnesses, many of whom spoke through tears, voices trembling as they tried to recall the sequence of events. Some described the first shot with clarity. Others admitted they froze and could not remember what happened until the screaming began. It became clear that the attack was not random. The bullets were aimed with intent, directed at the rival who had become the focus of months of festering anger. For investigators, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing not madness in the moment, but a calculated act born from obsession and resentment. As officers secured the scene, evidence was carefully collected. The weapon lay on the floor, tagged and bagged. Nearby, notes were discovered in the shooter's belongings, pages filled with accusations, scribbled grievances, and a distorted narrative of betrayal. Each line revealed a mind unraveling under the weight of paranoia, convinced of conspiracies that never truly existed. To those reading, it was chilling proof of how far unchecked thoughts could spiral when fed by anger and isolation. The detectives knew they were not only solving a crime, but uncovering the story of a breakdown that had been visible long before the first shot was fired. Co-workers, who gathered outside the building, spoke with disbelief. They described the rivalry, the whispered complaints, and the heavy air that had hung over the office for months. Many admitted they had sensed danger, but could never have imagined it reaching this point. They remembered slammed doors, bitter looks, and sudden outbursts. But those memories seemed small compared to the devastation left behind. What haunted them most was not just the violence itself, but the realization that they had all seen pieces of it coming and failed to understand the danger in time. For Charlotte police, the case became a sobering reminder of the fragility of workplaces under strain. The rivalry had been more than personal. It had poisoned an entire floor of employees, transforming routine stress into an atmosphere of fear and distrust. Now, in the aftermath, detectives pieced together the story for the public, determined to show that this was not an act of sudden madness, but a tragedy written slowly over months, ignored until it was too late. The shooting had ended in mere seconds, but the path toward it had been long, steady, and visible to anyone who cared to look. By the end of the day, the office building stood as a sealed crime scene, its silence broken only by the occasional flash of a camera or the low voices of investigators documenting evidence. Outside, families waited in anguish, desperate for news of loved ones who had not yet emerged. The city that morning had been alive with the ordinary pulse of business. But by evening, it carried the weight of grief and shock. The feud was over, yet the scars it left would mark not only those who witnessed it, but also an entire community, now forced to reckon with the truth of what had happened within those glass walls. In the weeks that followed, the office tower in Charlotte became more than just a workplace. It turned into a symbol of fragility, a place where ambition, rivalry, and silence had collided with devastating consequences. The building still stood tall, its glass windows reflecting the city's skyline, but for those who had walked its halls on the day of the shooting, nothing about it felt the same. Returning employees found themselves glancing at the floor where the violence had erupted, their minds replaying every detail they had tried so hard to forget. Some could not bring themselves to step inside at all, choosing instead to transfer or resign. The space that once promised careers and stability now carried the weight of trauma. A daily reminder that even in places built for progress, destruction could take root. Families of the victims faced an entirely different reality, one filled with grief that stretched far beyond the walls of the building. Funerals drew crowds of mourners, co-workers standing alongside relatives who struggled to make sense of the sudden loss. Photographs, eulogies, and flowers tried to honor lives cut short, but no speech or ceremony could erase the brutality of how it had ended. The violence felt senseless, yet it left scars that would never fully heal. For parents, spouses, and children, the tragedy was not just a news headline or workplace incident. It was a permanent wound, carried every day in silence. The shooter's fate unfolded in court, where the public watched with fascination and dread. Prosecutors presented evidence of a mind consumed by suspicion, while the defense tried to argue that stress and pressure had pushed the individual past the breaking point. The handwritten notes, filled with twisted accusations and detailed grievances, became central to the case. They showed intent, a clear picture of how months of anger had hardened into violent resolve. Witnesses from the office took the stand, their voices shaky as they recalled the days leading up to the shooting, describing the tense atmosphere that no one fully addressed until it was too late, when the verdict was delivered. It brought a measure of justice, but no real closure. The shooter would spend a lifetime behind bars, yet the punishment did nothing to restore the lives that had been taken, or the sense of safety that had been shattered. Justice, in this case, felt like a thin bandage placed over a wound far too deep to ever fully heal. For the city of Charlotte, the shooting became a story told with a mix of sorrow and warning. News outlets revisited the timeline, highlighting every missed opportunity to intervene. Experts spoke about workplace violence, about the signs that had been visible but ignored, and about the responsibility companies carried to protect their employees not only from financial stress, but from the human conflicts that could so easily spiral. It was no longer just a crime story, it was a cautionary tale. A lesson about how unchecked hostility could transform a place of routine into a site of tragedy. The survivors carried their own shadows. Some found themselves waking in the night to the sound of imagined gunfire, their dreams invaded by memories of crouching under desks as shots echoed above them. Others avoided crowds and office spaces altogether, unable to endure the reminder of what had happened. Trauma lingered in subtle ways, in the way someone jumped at a loud noise, in the way silence in a meeting felt heavier than before, in the way people avoided conflict as if fearing it might ignite into something more dangerous. Charlotte moved forward, as cities always do, but beneath the rhythm of everyday life lay the memory of those 5 shots. They remained a marker in time, a reminder of how quickly normalcy could shatter. The financial firm rebuilt its staff and resumed operations. But the people who had lived through the feud would never see their workplace as just an office again. It was a place where ambition turned to obsession, where silence allowed danger to grow, and where 5 gunshots carved a scar that would never fade. The story of the deadly office. Feud did not end with the trial or the headlines. It lived on in conversations whispered among workers, in the nervous glances shared across cubicles, and in the quiet warnings passed down in company training sessions. It stood as proof that the greatest dangers sometimes hide not in strangers or dark streets, but in the familiar spaces we trust the most. The shooting had ended in seconds, but its shadow stretched endlessly. A lasting reminder that behind glass walls and polished desks, the human heart is still capable of destruction.